Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Before I start, I just want to ask, does anybody here have any farming background? Okay. So I have a confession to make. I'm a city boy. And it's even worse than that. I'm not from Iowa. And it's even worse than that. I'm from Canada. But I have been here for a few years. And in the process of this, of restoring this barn, I've had help from the State Association, which I'll talk about. I've had help from lots of volunteers and met lots of wonderful people with different interests in photography, in painting, in history, in architecture, in archaeology. It's just been a wonderful journey for me. So, I'm going to talk about barns and round barns a little bit. I'll talk about the history of the two main people that were involved in this, Joshua Sechrist, the farmer, and Frank Longerbeam, the unique architect who designed this barn. There's nothing like this barn anywhere in the world. This is a very special place. The Sechrist 1883 octagonal barn. And I'll also share some of the adventures in the restoration of this and talk about why and how it can be used and is used now. So what is a barn? Well, it's not just a place for storing animals and equipment and for harvesting crops and processing the crops and fixing things. It actually is part of our culture, and it has memories to it, and places where we grew up and interacted with people and socialized. It's part of our history. So it really is, these barns are very, very special, very special. So here's a barn that's no longer around. This is on Highway 6, 5 miles east of Iowa City towards West Liberty. So this is a type over here, of one of the very first barns. There's square, small buildings used to hold some crops. For some reason, the screen that I'm looking at doesn't show the full screen on the projection. Is there anybody here? My screen shows more than your screen. Okay, we'll have to deal with it. Okay, so this is a bank barn, and I thought this was actually quite clever. This is before any kinds of hay lifts or anything, and you just move the hay up into the level, middle level, and you had the animals staying down below. And so you didn't have to hoist anything up, you just drop the hay and feed down below, referred to as a bank barn. The construction of these barns were actually pretty amazing too. And so here is people standing up on the beams and pushing up the posts with long sticks. Some children sitting in the front row, enjoying themselves, and some women back here who have probably been cooking all day long. Fortunately, now the women are the structural engineers designing the entire projects. This is a more recent version, and I think I like this one because they're actually putting on the wall boards from the inside. So they're passing out these wall boards and then nailing them in place. There's a guy standing there and some people there on the top. What I haven't figured out yet is how they put the last one in. That's a little more of a challenge, but very, very clever. And here they are pushing these things up on the side. In the good old days. And the joints were all very cleverly architected, and I actually brought some tools that I'd like you to have a look at afterwards. Probably half the tools, I'm not exactly sure what they did with them, but it's also amazing that for the most part, except for one or two small things like a boring machine, you could build a barn with just about everything on the table. It's just amazing what they went through, with the help of some horses, of course. So one of my favorite stories is in the process of this barn. I'm salvaging things, and it actually started off that it had been shingled twice with wood. I've used asphalt for the time being because it was more affordable in the short term. That's sometimes referred to as a stabilization instead of a restoration, because in the future somebody can go back in and take off the shingles. But as soon as I saw, as soon as I saw the shingle, Adanac, I knew exactly what that was. Does anybody recognize this company, Adanac, or where the company comes from? Canada, spelled backwards. Exactly. I knew it as soon as I saw it. It's Canada spelled backwards. And they're actually, look it up, it's from Vancouver in British Columbia in the old days. So it comes from Canada, spelled backwards. So round barns have actually been around for quite a while. And on one of my trips to Washington, D.C. many years ago, yes? You know who it is? Okay, hang on just for a second.
Because I was there when it happened, so I lived in that neighborhood.
Okay, oh, great.
I know the kids who did it.
Okay. Okay, there is a round barn in Iowa, and actually one of the people came out to my barn, and their son or something was involved in the restoration of this barn. But this is a very famous American farmer, George Washington.
Yeah.
Okay, George Washington, and this is I think it was 16-sided round barn that was built just on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. You can actually get to it. It's open as a great tourist site. This is it in 1870. It actually fell down, and they rebuilt it. And the reconstruction of this was actually done, my memory is, by somebody from Iowa.
The hayfield barn did burn down, and I was there when it happened.
Okay.
And that,
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And we kind of knew it was some of the spoiled brat little kids, because they built that neighborhood called Hayfield right there. Have you been to see it?
I have, yeah.
And it was in the early 70s.
Yeah.
And it was just horrible.
Yeah.
They built the whole wealthy neighborhood right around Hayfield.
Yeah.
Do you have any pictures of Hayfield?
I do not, no.
Oh, that's a shame. I'll have to look and see it.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, it's an incredible story, and again, this is available now for anybody on your next trip to Washington, D.C. You can actually go and see this 16-sided barn. There's also one, I think this is on a trip about 2 hours east of Boston. It's a shaker barn, and that's me in the early days, trying to pretend I'm a farmer. And that barn actually, I believe, came brick by brick in the restoration from Europe. And of course, it wasn't just barns, but people were building houses in a spectacular way. Anybody want to live in a house like this? Isn't that kind of special? Very unique.
Where is that?
I'm not sure. I don't think it's around anymore, but I think it was in outside of New York, but I'm not sure. So lots of debates about what the purpose of these things was, and the round barns in particular. So compared to a rectangular building, it was argued you had more floor space, greater volume, more convenient. In terms of feeding the animals, they were sometimes all faced to the center. But I think in part, it was the most convincing argument for me, especially in the Midwest, where most round barns are actually, is due to deflecting the wind. Okay, so that sort of makes sense to me anyways. So the kind of tools that are used are also a whole other story, and I have a lot of tools, but none of them are here. But the hay fork carrier system about moving things around and dropping them and in the round barn has to be pretty sophisticated strategies for moving these things up and down and getting them around in the building. And again, this was done initially with horses. One of the companies in Iowa actually was the Loudon Company, and they designed a lot of the early farming equipment. And this is called a grapple hay fork. And I actually found the original grapple hay fork for the barn out in one of the outbuildings in the back when I first started off with the property. So I have this, and I haven't done this in a few years, but I've had 4 or 5 events over the years where I've actually had some friends come out with horses and actually lift hay up into the barn with these things. And some people tell me when they were children or youngsters, they actually helped with the horses. Anybody actually done that? So leading the horses up, and you had to have really good hearing, because when someone said stop, you had to stop, right? But a very interesting part. So this story is about, in part, Joshua Sechrist. So Joshua Sechrist was from Ohio, and he came to Iowa in 1868 and bought this property. I think it was $1.25 or $2.50 an acre or something back then, and farmed quite successfully until 1893. He moved to 609 Summit Street, which the building is still there, and so Summit Street was certainly one of the premier places in Iowa City, and he was quite a successful farmer. He had hundreds of acres. I think the average size farm was about 150, and I think he had 450 acres of land at the time. So he did quite well and passed away in Iowa City. Here's a picture that I found. I was able to contact some of the family. This is Joshua Sechrist, the successful farmer who built the property, had the property built. So has anybody been to the farm before, the barn? Good, that's fantastic. And I presume some of you know where the town of Downey is, right? So Downey is just east of this place. And so the reason that Seacrest was successful in part was because of the train station. There's a train station, or was a train station, in Downey. And if you go up north, you can go up to West Branch, and Iowa City's out here 4 or 5 miles. And this is the big town of Downey in 1872. There's a train station and a few supply buildings over here and some scattered houses. So when I first started this project many years ago, I thought it would be nice to have a little town picnic for the town of Downey. Now, this is an unincorporated town, so I asked a few people, knocked on the door, and said, "Is there anybody in charge, or who could I ask about a town picnic?" And they all pointed to the same house, the same woman. She was kind of in charge of the town of Downey. So I knocked on the door and I said, "Hi, I'm Rich Tyler. I'm restoring the octagonal barn just west of town." And she said, "I know." So I said, "I'd like to have a town picnic. Is that okay?" And she said, "I'll think about it." So I said, "Okay." So I came back a week later, and she was very helpful. We ended up having a wonderful town picnic with lots of people came from actually around the state, and even some other states came by. They did an ad in the West Branch paper, and we had a great turnout. The Downey is pretty special. In fact, I've actually did quite a bit of research on Downey. One of the things that happened is there was a train wreck in Downey in the late 1800s, and that made all the local newspapers a big deal. I don't actually know this, but it almost looks like the barn might be out there in the field. It's about a mile away. This is from the grain elevators, and I kind of like this picture. So the train tracks are right here. This is the main center of the city over here, and there's a bank right here, which is still in existence. Not as a bank in the bankrupt days, but that's the main bank of Downey. There's also a schoolhouse, which has been abandoned, unfortunately, but still standing. I found the Downey Cemetery, which is actually about 3 or 4 miles east of town, out on a gravel road in the middle of nowhere. And Joshua Sechrist's grave is out here there, as well as Frank Longerbeam. So it's quite a ways out and not so easy to find, but I found it. So Joshua Sechrist, the farmer. So this is often referred to as the golden age of farming. So apparently in 1920, out of 3.2 billion bushels of hay, 80% of the world's total, Iowa had 15% of that. So the Sechrist farm that Joshua had promoted, again, he went on the train and he would ride the train to Colorado and New Mexico and buy calves and sheep and bring them back to the town of Downey and then march them down the dirt road back to the farmstead. And then he farmed several different crops, and they're reported in the census every year, and then would ship them back to Chicago. I mean, one reason for his success was how close it was to that big train station in Downey. So it had 520 acres at the time, so it was quite large compared to the average of 133 in Iowa. This is the stockyards in downtown Chicago. Doesn't look like this anymore, but you can imagine this is what Chicago looked like because it was located on the Great Lakes and there was lots of train stations coming in, and Chicago was the main center for this kind of transportation. And these are all places for cattle and cows and things and the horses. When I bought the property, there was also a windmill. And this is what it was like in the early days, but it was actually just about falling down when I purchased it, and I was not able to save it. I did take off the front part and move it up, but what I really want to do is I want to do this. I want to try and get some horses to pull it up and build an old wooden silo. And I actually went to a silo museum many years ago in Texas, which is pretty amazing. Great part of the history of this. But I can imagine pulling this up with horses, how they did these sorts of things in the good old days. Well, unfortunately, what happened was the Great Depression hit. And Guy Sechrist, his son, was taking charge of this. And although they were making progress in paying off their debt, in 1934, the property was lost. And the state of Iowa took over and sold it to Mr. Feltz for $19,000. He was not a farmer.
Did he still have 520 acres?
He did not have 520 acres, but not too much less than that. Well, I forget exactly, but that's a good question. So it was kind of sad, but that's what happened in those days. And now we'll sort of go back and talk a little bit about Frank Longerbeam. So Frank Longerbeam is the barn builder. And I should also say that I actually met Eleanor Seacrest, who lived down the street when I bought the property. And I think she passed away about 2 years ago at the age of 101 or 102, Eleanor Seacrest. But she actually had some things up in her attic that she didn't even know were there that she was able to share with me about the family, Eleanor Seacrest. So Frank Longerbeam, the barn builder. So Frank Longerbeam was also from Ohio. Mother died at the age of 10, when he was 10 years old, and he moved to Iowa with his grandparents. And in 1872, he purchased a house in Downey. 1878, he's advertising himself among the locals as a carpenter. And in 1883, apparently, I've been told by family members passed down, that this barn was planned around the kitchen table. Okay, so the farmhouse was actually built in the 1850s, and that's a different story, but the barn was actually planned around this. And I actually met some relatives who live in California from the Longerbeam family, and one of the family stories is that when Frank was later on in his 60s, he was still building some houses, And one of his relatives called him over and said, I want to build a house. I want you to look at the property. Would you come and help out with this? So Frank went over to the property, and the wood was already laid out. He'd already bought the wood by train probably. And Frank looked at it and said, I'm not building this. If I build something, I pick out the wood. So that gives you an indication of what he did. In any event, age 32 years, he built the Sechrist barn and lived in Downey throughout that time, passed away in 1918. So this is a bridge, a covered bridge near where Frank Longerbeam grew up. Okay? And what I want you to see about this bridge is this section here. These are laminated pieces of wood, big pieces of wood that are soaked in water and then bent and nailed together. And that's one of the suspension parts of this wooden bridge. And I don't know this, but it may very well be that Frank Longerbeam walked across this bridge to go to school as a child. So here's where Frank Longerbeam came from, over here in Ohio, and came all the way this way through the Quad Cities and then to Downey. So in about 1859. And that's important just to, again, to get a perspective of the Chicago cattle yards here, the Mississippi River, where the wood actually comes from for the most part, farmed up here, cut and floated down the river. And the farmers would actually, and construction people would actually go to the river, and that's where they would buy their wood from in the fields. So this is the town of Downey, that across from the train station that I showed you. And a family member gave me this photograph, and lots of really important people here, obviously. And when I saw this picture, I just sort of said, well, this must be Frank Longerbeam over here. He's big and strong, and he's got dirty boots and things. You can't see very. I figure he must be the, that must be Frank sitting on the end in the big metropolis of Downey.
When was that photograph taken, do you know?
I do not know where it was taken. It was taken in Downey, but I've got quite a collection of things over the years.
When you don't have a date on it?
I might have, but I don't know what it is now. So this is a family picture that they gave me. So this is 1900 approximately. And you can see Frank Longerbeam over here on the right-hand side. And it actually, if you go back and forth, it actually looks pretty much like that person sitting in the train station. So the family also gave me this picture of the Longerbeam house. So this is in that big metropolis of Downey. And this is the house that Frank Longerbeam built for himself. So it's quite spectacular. And I think that's his son there, and maybe some other children, and he may be up in the stair. Maybe took the picture. But this is the Longerbeam house. And of course, keep in mind, at that time, to advertise your wares, it was really important to show people that you knew what to do. So if you could build a beautiful house, if you could build a beautiful barn, you were more likely to get other businesses from other people to come forward and to participate and use you as the architect. So when I first moved to West Branch, where I initially lived when I moved back to Iowa City area, this is what the house looked like. And I actually went through the house at that time and actually harvested a couple of interesting pieces of wood, but it was a mess and quite dangerous. And of course, a couple years later, it's gone. And the interesting part of this historically is that, of course, people will never know that about this house, right? It's gone, and there's a new house there, but it's part of history is that things move on, and it's kind of sad that nobody ever knows about this house because it's gone, okay? So really interesting part of this story for me is this barn, where they got the idea for this barn, and because there's no barn like it in the world, okay? So I communicated, in fact, there's a book I think they have it at the library, called The Round Barns of Iowa. And the author-editor was Lowell Soike, who was at the State Historical Society in Des Moines. And I met with him several times, and he helped me out in doing some of the historical searches. And one of the interesting things about this story is that here's Downey over here, just east of Iowa City, and the Mississippi River coming down here. And as I mentioned, all the wood, for the most part, for houses and barns, all came from Minnesota or Illinois or for northeast Iowa and floated down here into the Mississippi River to different lumber plants. And the closest one to Downey was in Muscatine. So I just assumed that that's where Frank Longerbeam would ride on his horses to go and get his lumber. So I went down to Muscatine in the library, and people were very helpful. So one of the lumber barons was a man named Hershey, and Hershey eventually became one of the mayors, I think, of Muscatine, but also had a big lumber yard. And in addition to the lumber yard, he actually had built a dairy barn. And interestingly, this dairy barn, he actually hired somebody from out east to build this. And when it was built, it was actually reported in the Chicago newspaper in the 1870s, because this barn that was built by Benjamin Hershey was pretty spectacular and nothing like it at the time. So this is the wood being floated down the Mississippi and from Illinois. And one of the interesting things is that they would often have the lumber yards up north cut the wood first and then drill holes through some of the boards and make a little raft and then float it down that way. Anybody been to the Birthplace Cottage in West Branch, where Hoover was born, the little cottage? So if you go inside the cottage and you look up at the rafters, several of the rafters have big holes in them. And those holes are a result of this strategy for moving the lumber down the Mississippi River. So here's the Hershey Lumber Mill in Muscatine. And it's not there anymore, but actually the last time I was there about a year ago, you can still see hints of it. And across the street, again, it's being redone, but there's an actual office network for the Hershey Lumber Mill. So this is the barn that Benjamin Hershey had built. And what's special about this barn is this roof. So it's a bell-shaped roof. It's not a round roof. It's not two square edges. It's a bell-shaped roof. And that made it quite unique and quite special. So he had a dairy barn, and the site is still there, but unfortunately that barn is gone. But this is where the Hershey barn was. He had hired somebody from, I think, Baltimore to build the barn. This is an inside view of that barn. So you can't see it too well here, but these are laminations. We saw that laminations in the covered bridge that Frank Longerbeam might have seen. And here's a close-up. And again, Lowell Soike helped me find this. So this is a close-up of that Hershey barn in Muscatine. And they've got several different 2x6s nailed together and then with a big bolt going through the whole thing. So I'm guessing that Frank Longerbeam saw this. So here's the Hershey barn in 1946, and it is now gone. Okay? So here we are, 1883. So I did some research in life in 1883, and it turns out that one of the first skyscrapers was built in Chicago, or the first skyscraper, as some definition, in Chicago in 1883. But also the Brooklyn Bridge was completed. And I actually read a book on the Brooklyn Bridge that was about that thick. And the Brooklyn Bridge took years and years to build with all kinds of scandals and hassles. But it was finished in 1883. So on one of my early trips to New York, I actually walked across the Brooklyn Bridge. And I think you can still do that, and it's actually pretty special. So quite a unique feature, Brooklyn Bridge in 1883. So I went to the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library in their archives and looked through the West Branch newspaper at the time called The Local Record. And so it says, and Seacrest is spelled differently in a few different places, a thriving farmer finishing the foundation of a barn, nothing like it of its kind in the country. 75 feet high, 32 horses and 16 cows, room for 200 tons of loose hay. Now this is really special, except that the last part, with all the modern improvements, I have never found any of the modern improvements in the barn at all. But it is a pretty special place. So there's actually not a lot written on barn building in the old days. There's stuff written about the Brooklyn Bridge and about big skyscrapers and stuff, but there's really wasn't a lot of interest on early barn building. So I had a volunteer in the early days, actually, from discussions and from what I've learned, we decided this is likely how Frank Longerbeam built this. So digging trenches in the water, filling up trenches in the ground, filling them with water, soaking the wood in there, pounding stakes in the ground, and then bending these things one at a time around the stakes, and then nailing them in with square nails. And then once they all went through, there would be a bolt that went all the way through that curved structure. So that's the bell-shaped ridge. And here's what they would do. So they built the stone foundation first. It's a bank barn, so there's dirt over here. And this is being pulled by horses and guys on scaffolding with poles that we saw already. And this is the first piece going up by itself. Now it's kind of like a McDonald's arch in some ways. This is a lamination that's being pulled up one arch at a time on the foundation. So they get the one arch up and they're going to pull up one other at a time. This guy up here is sitting up there with a bag of square nails and a hammer. Does anybody want to volunteer for that job? And they're hoisting up one section at a time. So this is the final output of this. And I asked the structural engineer how to define this, and he said, well, it's like a bird cage. And that's exactly what it's like. So there it is, the outline of this barn that was built right close to here. So as far as I know, Frank Longerbeam was probably self-taught or taught by a relative or somebody back in Ohio, or who knows. There wasn't, you couldn't go to school to be an engineer. A lot of things was learned from trial and error and watching people, apprenticeships. This is a lap joint, and the lap joints would come down like this. And one of the problems with the lap joints is when the wood dried out, it would sometimes separate the wood a little bit. And what they did to try and correct this was pretty clever. They called a bladed scarf joint. Okay, so that way it couldn't bend as it was drying up. So I thought that was actually pretty clever, bladed scarf joint. So here's the picture of the Sechrist barn that Frank Longerbeam did, and this is one of the posts that I found. And it turns out this is where the posts were, and there's the bladed scarf joint holding up the upper level. Now, I don't really mean to be critical of Frank, but he put the posts in the wrong place. Can anybody say where the post should be?
In the middle of the joint.
Exactly right. This post right here should be right there, underneath here. And Frank actually had to go in afterwards because some of the beams actually split. With the compressive load from the roof, this part here, this piece of wood here, there's nothing underneath it holding it up. So he actually had to go in and cut this off and put another piece of wood going like that in some of the areas of the barn. So, and again, I'm not criticizing Frank at all, but an interesting observation. This is the inside of the barn. It's actually incredibly spectacular. And there is actually stairs going up, held suspended from the ceiling. So this is the hay fork area, the hay area intended for 200 tons of loose hay. A ton's about the weight of a small car. And there's originally four of these open hay chutes that they would crawl up with their hay forks and then pitch the hay down to the lower level of the barn where the horses and cows were. And this suspended staircase was pretty scary for me, but I have been up there, and I'll tell you about that in a while. So I'm looking in the library through the history of Johnson County, and lo and behold, I find a picture of the barn from 1893 in the history of Johnson County. So somebody had paid attention to this and done, I think it's called the lithograph of the place at the time. So here's the gravel road. These trees are still here. They're a little bigger now, but the trees are still there. Maybe this is Joshua over here, I don't really know. The windmill is gone, but I did find on the property, this is also quite interesting, there's a well there that was made with bricks. And Joe Ryan, who I bought the property off of, did not live there. But before he filled it in, I asked him to drop something in a line and find out how deep it was. I think it was 75 feet deep. And it's built by starting off in the ground, digging down a foot, and then putting in 2 layers of brick all around. And then digging down a bit more and putting in 2 more layers of brick all around. And then digging down from the top down, building a well like that. And so I have exposed it, but I've only exposed the top 4 feet, and the rest of it's all been filled in with sand and things like that. But can you imagine building that well in those days from the top down? So in any event, here's the barn, and the farmhouse. It's right here in Johnson County, 1893. This is a view from the cupola, and here's the big metropolis of Downey in the background. The gravel road that Joshua Seacrest would march the cattle and cows back and forth. The train station runs right through there. And that's what the property looked like at that time. I also discovered a 1918 photograph of the barn showing it's in pretty good shape at that time, actually. And also met Marjorie Hayek, who was an artist in the Iowa City area, and she drew the barn in 1970, and actually in pretty good shape at that time. The sides are straight up and down, and that was not the case when I purchased the property. 1970. I also found an early photograph of the place, and so, let's see, so the barn's in good shape here and the barn's white. So I have had a few grants from the State Historical Society, and I had to paint the barn the original color, which it turns out was red. And if you look in the attached cattle feeding shed, which I'll show you later, you can see the original paintwork of the barn is red paint. So I painted the barn red, and all the people in Downey were not happy with me because they were used to the barn being white, but it was originally red, and so that's what it got back to be. So what did it look like back in 1992? Probably one of the first trips I made out to the barn. So here's the barn behind here, all kinds of tall trees growing around it, which were actually pretty dangerous and had to be changed. This is the attached cattle feeding shed, which was built a few years afterwards. And this is a round tile silo, which was added afterwards, probably before 1900, and again, primarily involved from designs in Iowa. So one section of the barn here in these early days is maybe you can see how it's bowed out. So this is supposed to be straight up and down, but this is one of the corners and it's bowed out a little bit. So one of the problems is the compressive load of the roof is pushing down, and the wood shingles, when they get all wet, they get heavy, and it's pushing down and bowing out the sides, the 8 different corners of the barn. So that's one problem with the restoration. This is the wooden shingles, and looking up from the top of the barn to the cupola. This is standing in the middle of the barn, looking up. Suspended staircase. These are not stars, these are holes in the roof. And of course, that's a major problem with restoration like this because it allows moisture in, and there was 2 or 3 feet of hay everywhere and all kinds of things on the floor gathering moisture, and that leads to mold and problems with the roof, with the wood rotting. So the suspended stairway, I never thought I'd ever go up there. The roofing contractors, I had a couple of them come out and they went up like there was nothing to it. There's no way that you can fall out of this thing. It's got wood on both sides. Now the whole thing could fall down, of course. It was built in 1883, but again, the other family members told me with Frank Longerbeam, where one carpenter would put in 3 nails, Frank would put in 5. And it's actually pretty strongly connected, and I do have to go up there usually once or twice a year. This is the condition of the barn at that time. So there was a kind of a solid floor in one area, but in other areas it was just planks on the ground, I presume to enable the hay to dry for air circulation. But it was just lying there and a wonderful place for collecting moisture or for a fire. This is the front door of the barn over here, looking out towards the farmhouse in that way. And so functionally, they would bring the hay in here and actually lift hay up into the barn at this point, move it around on this circular plot and drop it in there. This is not part of this talk, but it's just a nice story. One of the volunteers was actually an engineer from Cedar Rapids, and he did, as part of his work, sonar work, and knew how to tie ropes together. And so he had to drop rope underwater so that it wouldn't be picked up, and then they'd have metal things and detect them. In any event, I bought the rope, and he actually twisted the rope back in and put it all in place and got it all tied, and it was just amazing. He actually formed, as a function of that, a National Rope Association. As a gift, a year later, I found an old rope making machine about this big and gave it to him as a gift. And he actually manufactured them for a while and actually wrote a book on rope making. And the funny part of the story is that I went to Amsterdam a few years later, and there's only 2 museums open late at night in Amsterdam. Some of you have been. One of them is the Hemp Museum, and the other one's the Sex Museum. So in the Hemp Museum, it's not just about marijuana and stuff like that, but it's actually about hemp and the plants that they would go and actually use for this. And they had some rope making machines, and it was actually quite an interesting exhibit. And sure enough, on the shelf is this guy's book. So I had to get the manager, and I said, I want you to open up this book because I mentioned in the foreword of this book. So that's the story. So this is my...
Sir?
Yep.
On that track around where they brought the hay in,
Yep.
and then lifted, is that a wood track?
It's a metal track. And again, this is in a different talk that I have, but there's a metal track in the company, I don't know that I remember the company, but the company that did all these, the circular track and the hay fork and the hay fork carrier system is actually from Illinois. And it's quite an interesting story of how it all works and quite complicated. But I have all the original stuff there and can share that stuff with you. So pretty clever strategy. So this is my sister coming out at those early days. She's from Canada, and she's looking at this place and all the hay and all the mess, and she's, what the hell is he doing? And she was probably right. Okay, so this is the attached cattle feeding shed that I mentioned. And this is also quite an amazing part. In fact, I actually had somebody from Washington, D.C. with the Historical Society come out, and he was really interested in this in one of the stone silos out in the back. But the amazing part of this is that the barn's here. You drop the hay down. You can drop it down to the bottom where the horses are, or you can actually stop it on the center floor. And then there's two rails and an old, this is an actual axle from a train, two axles and a conversion wagon that they built. Dropped the hay, put the hay on the wagon, pushed the wagon out into the attached cattle feeding shed, which was added later, and they had feeding stalls out here. And they just pushed the hay into the feeding stalls and bring the cattle in from the fields instead of having to take the hay out to them. So again, pretty clever strategy.
Is any of that
and very
still there?
sophisticated. Pardon?
Is any of that apparatus still there?
It absolutely is. Yep. I did my best to save everything. In fact, part of my focus in the restoration was I didn't want to make a museum out of this. I wanted to restore it as carefully as I could to what it was like in 1883. Now, I've since realized that, well, I've got farm equipment and tools that I bought at yard sales and auctions and people donated. And if they weren't out on display, they'd be in some back closet until I died, and it would be. So I started hanging up a few things to make it a little more accessible. But this is easily viewed, this cattle feeding shed. Okay, the restoration. So a lot of big companies weren't interested in doing help like this. A lot of them didn't know what to do, but actually a group in Iowa City, Van Winkle Jacob Engineering, took the task on and did an amazing job. So the first thing that they did here was draw a sketch here of the section. So here is the bank barn. So here they actually suggested there was two major problems. One I mentioned already, the compressive load of the roof was pushing the ribs out. And the second problem was this is all full of dirt. And this is actually, dirt gets wet and heavier, and it's actually pushing the construction, pushing the whole barn over on the side. So that had to be considered as well. There were original stairs still there at the back going down, and some stairs up here where my sister was peeking up. And the hay chutes, 4 of those were original. But this is the drawing of the dimensions of the property at that time. Again, room up here for 200 tons of loose hay. A view from the top. One of the things they did, we'll show you, is they put cables. They put a big anchor around each one of these ribs, a steel, and then with a steel cable, pulled the barn in on all the 4 different cables, one at a time, sort of turned them in. I thought it was going to do, when I first talked to them, we were going to move it in a ½ an inch or an inch every week. And I took a movie of this actually. They did, some places, 12 to 14 inches they pulled in a couple hours, which was kind of freaky. But that was an important part of this barn that was being bowed out from the compressive load of the roof.
Did they leave the cables?
Yes, the cables are there, but I had them put them just below the floor so they're not quite as noticeable. A side angle, and this is some architecture drawings that I did about the levels and the different laminations. And one of the interesting things about this is how the wood, when it comes down, again, this is the bell-shaped roof, which makes it unique. There's nothing like this anywhere in the world as far as I can tell, and the exterior wall. But how this is connected to the foundation is also very clever. So they've got these laminations. There's, I think, 16 different boards all nailed and bolted together. And here it is coming to the floor. This is after the restoration. So there's actually, there's a steel three-sided bar on the other side of this going above and below the main floor here. And then they drove a big bolt through and kept it in place. But what I wanted to show you was what Frank Longerbeam did to connect this lamination, this rib, to the foundation. And amazingly clever. This is a big wooden block. This is sitting on, actually this is a big, I forget exactly, 12 by 14 piece of lumber sitting on, a long piece sitting on top of the stone foundation. And what they did was they cut out a big section in the middle of that, and then the lamination that going through here, these are the nails and the bolts, but they actually left 3 or 4 of these, instead of cutting them off on the floor level, they left them deeper. So they could actually fit inside that lamination, so that rib couldn't move. It was incredibly clever. So here is the outside during the restoration. And this is where we were just looking at right here in the foundation. And so again, some water's gotten in that and it's bad, but in pretty good shape actually. This is the brace. This is the steel brace that I talked about where they're pulling in the sides. So there's 4 of those pulling in from the sides that are keeping it upright. This is what that brace looks like from the inside. So here's the upper floor. So they did this just below the floor, so it's not too noticeable. They also, these are, I think, 2 by 10s, and they were bowing out along the 10-inch dimension, which is pretty amazing. And so in a couple of places, in 2 or 3 of the corners, they had to put on an extra piece of wood to keep it in place there. And then this is how they fixed the barn that was being pushed over onto one side because of the bank. They took out the bank and they put this little L-shaped steel brace on the inside of the 2 corners where it was being pushed away. And then they put a steel rod through the one side of the barn all the way out the front and buried in the ground in a big concrete block that they put underground, so you can't see that. I could take this out, but I was advised, you know, it's hardly noticeable, and it's a good thing for the future to keep it in place like that. You can also see the cattle feeding shed and the round silo at the end. The process of the roof going on was pretty amazing. Watching these people do the job. And again, this is the scaffolding. I'd never really been on scaffolding in my life before, but I did it. I went up and actually my son and I painted the barn red with paintbrushes. And we organized this, coordinated with the roofing contractor from Cedar Rapids, and they put up the scaffolding and to put on one section, 1/8 of the roof. And when the scaffolding was up, my son and I got up here on the scaffolding and painted the one side red. When we were done and they were done, they moved the scaffolding over to the next side and we all started over again. This is my picture of the scaffolding looking down. I didn't want to do that very much. This is the basement of the barn. Again, you can't see them here, but the end of the hay chutes are, there are 4 of those coming down here. And this was all full of dirt and manure and things, and it wasn't really clear how it was. And so I did a lot of research and visited a lot of old barns to see how I thought that it might have worked out. We had to do some structural work here, and of course originally in 1883 the floor was dirt, and they just put these wooden posts in the dirt, which meant they were all rotting away at the base, so they all had to be lifted up. I did a couple of these myself, but when I got a grant I actually had some of the structural and engineers do this. My neighbor and friend Jim Racy, who's still around in West Branch, helped me with one of these pieces of wood in the basement was split, and we jacked this up, and he actually built these clamps by hand, and we fixed that up. This is the outside of the barn. These are not bricks, these were stones that had to be redone, and these were redone by a couple of fraternities and sororities that have volunteered over the years. They've been very, very helpful. This is the attached cattle feeding shed. It was, they did the roof of this secondly so we could have access to the barn. This is the cattle feeding shed when we worked on this, and again, there's the train track rail coming through here, and this is some of the posts that went down into the dirt. They were rotted off. They had to be jacked up, filled in with concrete, and then build some other foundation for the post to be set back in place. The cattle feeding shed. Here's a view from the barn, looking out into the barn, well, a nice view with no roof, and here's the train tracks going out there in the silo. They could also push the train car all the way down to the silo, unload the silage from the silo, push it back down on this little ramp they used, and bring it into the barn, and then put it down the hay chutes down to the cattle and cows waiting down below. So this is what I decided the horse chutes look like. So not 100% sure, but this is what I could, the best I could figure out. So this is what the horses were in down below, and apparently horses work together. So the two horses work together and live together and were in the stall together all the time. And in some places there was some of the original equipment there as well. So one of my stories is that I actually took a class at the West Branch Presidential Library on historical things and how you're not supposed to pretend you have something old if you don't. And so anyways, I wanted to build a horse to hang some equipment on. So I thought, after taking this class, I thought, well, I'll just make a 2x4 structure and hang the stuff on the 2x4 structure of this horse. So I had a big diagram of this 2x4 structure outline of a horse. And I was given this tour to these grade 3s and showed them this picture of the horse I was going to build. And this girl looked at me and she said, "Have you ever seen a horse before?" So I thought I'd better make something that looked like a horse. So, yes?
Do you still have the actual tack with the traces? They're called traces, I think, the gear.
Well, yes, well, I have, there was hardly anything left in the barn when I bought the barn. I actually found a screwdriver behind one of the things that I tell the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library people that probably Hoover's dad made the screwdriver, but I don't know that.
With the leather gear.
There was hardly anything left in the barn at all.
Okay,
Yes.
you replace it, and can we see it?
Yes, all the things there are, and I'll tell you more about going out there and seeing it, but all this stuff that are there now are things that people have donated or I purchased or got from various different strategies. But it's all there and there to see. Anyway, so back to the story. So in any event, I felt like I better do a better job for this young girl. So I waited until the boss was out of town. I got a picture of a horse. I put it on the overhead projector. I projected this horse on our conference room wall, traced it out, and lo and behold, made something that looks like a horse. Quite proud of that. I actually did the same thing for a cow. And so there are some cows now in the lower level. And initial equipment, and actually some of the tours and the hosts, I've had a few events out here, and you could actually milk the cows, sort of. And actually I got certified at the Minnesota State Fair for milking cows, where I actually milked a real cow. Okay, this is the restoration of the silo. Amazing what these people would do. It's kind of different now, but they repointed the silo on these ladders. I don't know that they would use these things anymore, but that's what they did, so that's great. The silo's in really good shape. I wanted to acknowledge grant support from the State Historical Society. The Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs monitors this. And if you get a grant from this for a historical structure, you can actually get a rebate or some incentive for tax preservation. Also, there was a large area in Iowa City called the Friends of Historic Preservation. And I'm also, as funded by this, an Iowa Humanities Speakers Bureau, of which I have 3 talks, and I enjoy going around the state sharing some of the stories. This is the Department of Cultural Affairs website, and lo and behold, I was surprised to see that on their website they had a picture of the barn. And it's because of their program that the barn is still there in part. So that's a nice thing. I also got a recent grant because the roof needed to be redone once again. And so this was featured in the West Branch Times last November. And they actually went up and redid the roof. And
Are they wood shingles?
these are not wood shingles, I'm sorry to say, but they could be one day. Wood shingles are a lot more expensive, and it's also more complicated to find somebody that could do it. So the shingles will last for another 25, 30 years. It could take wood shingles eventually. I don't know what the period is lasting there, but for now. So I've been fortunate to meet thousands of volunteers over the years. These are some of the fraternities. The people from Cornell College, this Phi Kappa Nu has been helping enormously for many, many years. There's a church group that comes out on a regular basis, and Upward Bound students would come out on a regular basis via bus. So lots of really nice people. These are some of the volunteers helping out. My daughter, we actually ended up, some people came out from the Writers' Workshop that brought their friends from New York City. My daughter and I ended up on page 3 of the New York Times, restoring the thing. Small picture, but it was a story about the barn, so that was kind of nice. And one of the people that lived in the barn, it was hardly livable at the time when I first bought it, but some students went out there from the Writers' Workshop, and the woman wrote a book called The Ex-Boyfriend's Cookbook, and there's a picture of the barn in the book, so that's kind of cool. Some of the volunteers from various places over the years. Again, lots of fond memories. Anybody recognize this volunteer? Terry Branstad, yeah. So I contacted him early on when I got a grant, and he was coming to Iowa City, so I thought, well, this is funded by the state in part, I'll show the barn off. So again, very early stage, and I had two binders for signing in the barn. One of the books is a volunteer book, and one of the book is a visitor's book. So I asked him which book he'd like to sign. So he said, I'll sign the volunteer book. So Terry went out in the back, and I gave him a shovel and a wheelbarrow, and he shoveled some of the cow manure off of the back patio out there. And the West Branch Times took this picture and put it on their front page. So thank you, Terry. So why save an old barn? Well, lots of opportunities for fun. The barn is open all the time from 9 till 7 p.m. for free. It's only good if I use it, so you don't need to ask permission. You're just welcome to go out there. Nonprofit groups use it for free. So there's a Red Barn chamber music, which has, there's several, been out there several times. And I do rent it out for weddings, and all the money goes to the restoration. So here's just some parties. This is the Red Barn chamber music. People go out there playing music, dancing. Actually, I do research on tinnitus at the university, and I have a conference every year, and we always have a square dance in the round barn and a barbecue every June. And the sad thing is, when I go over to Europe and talk about my research, people don't ask me about my research. They say, how's the round barn? Weddings. And my friend Martha actually put it in her wedding magazine. So a couple years, 3 or 4 years ago now, there was a homosexual wedding in the barn, and the article was about the wedding, but Martha Stewart actually put it in her wedding magazine, which was kind of cool.
What year was that?
I think it's about 3 years ago now, maybe 2 or 3 years ago.
Says 2015.
Is that what it says? Okay, thank you, 2015. Time flies. And of course, I also looked around and found somebody drawing things, and I contacted this woman, and she was interested. P. Buckley Moss came out and did a drawing of the barn, and I took her to the Presidential Library. She'd never been out to see the Herbert Hoover birthplace cottage, and she did a drawing of that. She had a banquet, a dinner inside the barn to show her work, and had lots of people who are appreciative of P. Buckley Moss's work. So that was kind of fun for me to connect with her, and drew a nice picture of the barn and the farmhouse. Lo and behold, I got a phone call from somebody and said, hey, your barn's on a Christmas card. So this was at a truck stop or something on the interstate. So I drove out there, and sure enough, there were 3 boxes of Christmas cards. I bought them all when the barn was white back then. Had several people, interestingly, this person actually stayed there for a while. He's a photographer and a storm chaser. Is that what they call them? So he was really interested in photography. So this is a camera that was left out all night long as the stars move across the sky, which is pretty cool. Much to my surprise, the West Liberty phone book and West Branch phone book has it on their front cover a few years ago, which is great. Much to my surprise, what's this lake or pond? It's actually the cover of a car. They used it for reflection, which kind of surprised me. Beautiful opportunities for photographs. This is the Bothell barn. So actually, Frank Longerbeam built 2 barns. And this barn was just about, when I first moved there, this was about a mile away, and it wasn't, this is a painting that was done in 1973, and I found an earlier photograph of it as well later on. And I actually salvaged a few things, but I talked to the farmer, and he let me come out and take some pictures and grab some things, but it wasn't in bad shape, and he really didn't have any need for it. And so I asked him if it was okay if I contacted some newspapers at the time, just when he was going to destroy it, just because to get people interested in preservation. And so I got a phone call early in the morning. By the time I got out there, it was already 50 people there with lots of photographs. And the amazing thing is, it was so hot, you couldn't get within almost 100 yards. The heat coming off of this was just amazing. So that was covered in a few of the load of local photographs. So to close now, history is important. It helps us move forward in the future to see where we've been and what we've learned and how do we understand where we're at right now. Iowa barns indeed are very, very special. Our farming heritage and the structure and things is really, really important. There are some economical advantages. There are barns being converted into restaurants and shops and things, and it's very special for tourism. And there are some barn tours that go around. Part of it, however, for me, is it's the value to talk to people who have farming backgrounds, to grew up on farms, that helped in the farm, that helped build farms, that helped build barns, and just really an important part of it. And of course, nurturing friendships. We all have close ties with people we grew up with, and in farming communities, the connection to the farming and the barns is a very important part of our history and our lives. So when I go around the state, I always tell them that we have bigger corn in Johnson County than they do in their areas. You're welcome to go out to the barn, as I said, anytime. You don't need to ask. Anytime from 9 a.m. to about 7 p.m. It's open. Just go on out and enjoy it. There's picnic tables out there. This is the map to get there. So we're in Iowa City over here. And so you could either take the interstate and you go to West Branch and you get off I-80 and you'll come off this way. And instead of going left to West Branch, you'll go right down this local road and you'll cross the the train tracks. The collision has been cleared off. And you go into the big town of Downey, and there's 3 gravel roads. You can turn right on any one of those. You'll hit at the T-junction at the other end, and you'll follow that gravel road, and about a half mile out of town, you'll see the big octagonal barn on the right-hand side of the road. You can also go on Highway 6 from here, from the bend of the road out towards West Liberty. When the road bends here, there's a gravel road here called Oasis, and you can turn left on Oasis there and just go about a quarter of a mile on the gravel road and take the first right on the Osage Street, and you'll get there. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation. Email, right. So my email is Richard, R-I-C-H-A-R-D, Richard, Iowa.
It's all one word.
All one word, 1883, which is when the barn was built. Richard, Iowa, 1883 at gmail.com. Richard, Iowa, 1883 at gmail.com. Okay, thank you very much. You're welcome to have a look at some of the tools up here. See if you can figure out what some of these tools actually are for.
I used to direct the civic engagement program at the University of Iowa before I retired. So, you know, throwing the volunteer fairs and helping students and also faculty who are involved in service learning to connect with folks. And it just